Welcome to this rapid revision video looking at the Great Plague of 1665. This was an epidemic, not a pandemic. It was centred on London. Therefore, it is not the same thing as a Black Death, and we'll come back to that distinction in a moment. This is the Great Plague of 1665. Like the Black Death, it was caused by infected fleas causing bubonic plague. In that respect, it is basically the same as the Black Death, but in crucial ways it was not, and you really do need to know the difference. Firstly, it took place purely in London, not the whole of Europe. And secondly, it happened 300 years after the Black Death. So if you mistake the two, you're not going to be forgiven for it in the exam. So do be careful. Let's take a moment or two to have a look at how people responded to the Great Plague. There were indeed some similarities between the Great Plague and its responses in 1665 with earlier responses to the Black Death. Here are some common beliefs and causes of the time in 1665 though. Some people still believed in God's punishment, also the idea of bad air or miasma causing the disease, and contact with the dead and the disease was also believed to cause it. However, another idea was that cats and dogs were spreading the disease. When you think about it, this was quite close to what was really happening with the fleas on the rats. However, by getting rid of the cats and dogs, it would make matters worse, as we'll see. So prayer was still used as a way of trying to prevent the disease. And bonfires were lit in the streets, burning tar. The acrid smoke from this would replace or push out the bad air of the miasma. That was what was believed anyway. Also, people were determined to take the dead and bury them outside the city, such as in this cart here. That was important because it helped people avoid contact with the dead and diseased. They also went to great lengths to mark people's houses and prevent people going in and out and catching the plague and spreading it. A little bit like the COVID lockdowns, if you like. Also, they would spread the news of the plague by word of mouth, ringing a bell and calling out, "Bring out your dead." There were publicly available gazettes which would actually have lists of who had died within each parish too. Also, some people would leave the city to try and avoid the plague, but this was only really an option for the rich who might have houses in the countryside. And then we've got the killing of cats and dogs. They were thought to spread the plague, but ironically, they actually caught the rats that carried it, so if anything, that would have made matters worse. When we looked at the Black Death in that video, I showed a picture of the typical plague doctor with the distinctive bird-faced costume, and I cautioned you against associating that with the Black Death. Well, I was right to. It comes 300 years later. We're going to have a look at it now though, because it's got some relevance to understanding what people thought caused the disease and also how people prevented it. But I would stress that the occurrence of the plague doctor has been massively exaggerated. It's probably pretty rare that people actually wore this costume. Probably even rarer that it was worn in Britain, and in fact I've got some doubts that it would have even appeared during the Great Plague at all. But nevertheless, let's have a look at it. Firstly, the most distinctive part of the costume, the beak of sweet-smelling herbs to combat bad air. This might have actually done some good in terms of filtering out the harmful droplets of some of the plague strains. There's also a stick to ward off the victims and keep them at arm's length, but also to check on the dead and check on the diseased without actually coming into contact with them. There is similar thinking behind the heavy gloves to stop contact with the victims too. And the long coat, which provided further restrictions on the contact with bad air and the victims. And lastly, the mask as a whole to protect the doctor from the bad air, including glass eye holes which they could look through. So remember again, the common beliefs and causes at the time. God's punishment is not so much covered here, but bad air and miasma is very much being focused on here, and prevention to try and keep it away from people, but also the lengths that the doctor has gone to avoid direct contact with the dead and the disease. Have a look at these bills of mortality and recording deaths. There it is in its entirety, and I wouldn't expect you to be able to read it like that, so we'll zoom in a little bit further. There are all sorts of different reasons why people have died, and they've all been recorded on here. And you can see that the record keeping is getting a lot more advanced and detailed than it has before. You've got some things which we'd actually recognise today. For example, bleeding to death. 16 people seem to have succumbed to that. Rather alarmingly, 21 people appear to have been executed. And then we've actually got other things which you wouldn't be at all familiar with today. For example, we've got something that looks like rifing of the lights. It's actually rising of the lights, which was a lung condition. But the one that we're really concerned with is this one here, plague. Look at the figures compared to everything else. plague has accounted for 63,596 deaths up until the year ending the 19th of December 1665, showing the dreadful death toll of the Great Plague of 1665. So what was done? This particular image gives us one indication, and it concerns the burial and removal of the dead. Again, avoiding contact with the dead and the disease was considered important for preventing the spread of the disease, and although not entirely unhelpful, it probably wouldn't have done much good given that the actual cause was the fleas. However, source A shows a 17th century picture of plague victims being buried in a churchyard outside of London during the Great Plague, and we can see the city in the distance. By 17th century, we can kind of assume that this is roughly contemporary with the plague, as it happened in the 1600s. And we can see here real examples of archaeological remains which seem to corroborate or back up what this source shows. Note that this would have been a Christian burial, but it seems to have been done with a certain amount of, dare I say, disrespect, or at the very least, panic, as people have been simply thrown into the grave, all one on top of the other, rather than respectfully laid out east-west. So how did the government respond? To try and beat the plague, the Lord Mayor of London created orders that people had to follow. Here are a few of them. Jobs were given to people to be in charge of street cleaning and rubbish collection. Large groups of people were not allowed to meet up in a particular place. Deaths had to be recorded, as we've seen from the bills of mortality. Infected houses had to be closed up and marked with a cross, and closed for 40 days until either the person was better or the person had died. Beggars were to be arrested. Bit unfair, but they were assumed to spread the disease. Plague doctors were appointed to report cases of sickness, although, as I've said, the distinctive costumes were probably pretty rare, if they were seen at all. Rakers cleared away sewage and threw it into the river. Well, this could have caused its own problems in terms of the drinking water supply, but it was really about trying to remove the miasma from the smell. Bonfires were lit on street corners too, to try and overpower the miasma. And watchers guarded infected houses day and night, making sure that nobody was breaking the quarantine. Female searchers carrying staffs or big sticks examined the dead for signs of plague, and indeed signs for life. Public entertainments were also to be stopped. No more going to see Shakespeare's latest play in the theatre, though I should point out he'd actually died about 30 years earlier. And the 12th one, dogs, cats, pigs and pigeons were banned from the streets and killed. It's estimated that around 40,000 dogs were killed in London at this time, but remember, it wouldn't have done any good. It wasn't the fleas on the dogs that were spreading it. Bodies were also to be buried after dark, as an extra precaution. So what finally finished the Great Plague? Perhaps you've been told that this did, the Great Fire of London, which occurred in 1666. Let's put it to the test. There are two main opinions or interpretations about what actually ended the plague. Interpretation 1 suggests that the Great Plague of 1665 was ended by the Great Fire in 1666 because it killed the rats who were carrying the plague and it destroyed unhealthy houses, although it wouldn't necessarily have been understood at the time. Interpretation 2 suggests that the Great Plague of 1665 was already dying out by the end of 1666, so the end of the plague and the fire was just a coincidence. Which interpretation have you heard before, and which do you agree with? Well, let's put it to the test with some evidence. Firstly, evidence 1. Bills of mortality, like the one that we've seen, show a peak of 7,165 plague deaths in London in the week beginning the 19th of September 1665, but then they fell steadily over the autumn and winter, and that even the King felt safe to return to the Palace of Whitehall on the 1st of February 1666. It's worth noting that the fire wasn't until September 1666, which is well after the peak of the plague in 1665. So does this support interpretation 1 or interpretation 2? Really, this supports interpretation 2, for the plague was already dying out. What about our next bit of evidence? This is a graph showing the rate of plague deaths between 1665 and 1666. You can really see that peak there in around September of 1665. So does this support interpretation 1 or interpretation 2? Again, I'd suggest it's interpretation 2. The plague is peaking and there are a couple of other little spikes in the data, but for the most part it is dying out through into 1666 and indeed the Great Fire, which was in September of 1666. Evidence 3 is from the Story of the Great Fire of London by historian Adrian Tinniswood, written in about 2004. The hot summer of 1666 showed that although the plague was declining in London, it was actually far from over. The disease claimed 38 deaths in the last week of July and 162 in August. Bills of mortality for the 28th of August 1666 show that there have been 30 deaths that were attributed to plague. So does this suggest interpretation 1 or 2? On the face of things, you might say interpretation 1, because it shows that the plague was still there and it hadn't in fact died out by the time the fire hit in 1666, or rather later 1666. However, I'd take that with a little bit of caution. These figures here, sad as they would have been for the people at the time, are tiny in comparison to the thousands who were dying in 1665. Overall then, I hope you agree with me that really the Great Fire had nothing to do with the ending of the plague. Indeed, one of the most powerful bits of evidence I've not even shown you. The plague deaths tended to happen in the poorest communities, whereas the Great Fire wiped out most of the really wealthy areas in the City of London north of the River Thames. That tells us more that living conditions had far more to do with why people died from the plague and why they caught it, than where the fire was and where the rats would have been killed. Some final points then. The plague wiped out around a fifth of London's population. Somewhere around 100,000 people died in just 7 months. Many measures were taken to combat the plague, but few, if any, worked. The Renaissance period saw many scientific advances. Think about Vesalius, Sydenham and Harvey. Why didn't this help stop the plague? Well, unfortunately, the actual cause of the disease was still not known, so it was difficult to devise effective treatments and effective prevention. So that concludes this video on the Great Plague of 1665. I hope it's been useful to you, and if it has, please drop the video a like and subscribe to the channel. But for now, I'll say good health.